This is a great conversation, and frankly, a sort of a long overdue conversation. We wanted to have this before the holidays, and then we were hit with some snowstorms, which certainly hit the Lehigh Valley pretty hard. So it's exciting to have this conversation now, and to be having it with some, for those of you in our office, with two really incredible people. We've got Berrisford Boothe. Berris will raise his hand in a second, and we'll ask him to introduce himself. Berris is an artist, an educator, a curator, and our former professor. He taught Tom, Andrew, and I dare I say it, but something like 27, 28, 29, 30 years ago.
Freaking long time ago.
A long time ago. So, when you start looking at the gray right here and you say, okay, well, that was 30 years ago. And Berris, frankly, still looks the same, which, what can you say about that? Berris, we all arrived at Lehigh at the same time. We were all young. I think Berris arrived right around the same time that we did. Berris, as you'll see through the course of this interview, or course of discussion, it's not an interview, is full of passion, full of energy, and came to a school that in the early 90s was still a conservative engineering school. It's a school that, and today, to a certain degree, is still a fairly conservative engineering and business school. And so Berris, along with some of the other faculty in the Department of Art and Architecture, came with new ideas, came with really wanting to sort of shake things up, turn things on their head. And of course, you had impressionable youth like me, Tom, and Andrew, who we were at this school, which we cared very much about, but we're also very excited to sort of follow their lead and to shake things up as well. And it was a really, really interesting time to be at the school because the department was fairly young and really trying new things. And the department was savvy enough at that time, still very savvy, to know how to talk the talk with the more conservative folks, but also get what they wanted to move the needle. And I think we felt we were there at a time when we were part of moving the needle. Needles move very slowly, but we definitely felt like we were part of that change. And Berris brought with him a former student of his, who we've now had the pleasure to meet a few times, Domenica Massamby, who's on the call as well. Domenica graduated in 2017 from the School of Art and Architecture and is now a designer for a firm in Philadelphia called Digsaw. So we're really happy to have both of them on the call. We're going to get two different perspectives. One, a slightly more mature one from someone, not that Domenica's not mature, but someone who's been at the school for a long time, and a perspective from a young architect who is recently graduated and emerging into the field in a big city. So it's really exciting to have the conversation with them. Ask both of them to introduce themselves. Berris, if you would just tell us a little about yourself, and then Domenica the same thing, and then we can start the discussion.
Hello all. Congratulations on making it to 2021. Let's hope we can get to 2022 intact. It's great to see Tom and Matt and Andrew. Where's Andrew? No, he's not here.
I'm here.
Where are you? There you are. Hey, man.
I'm here.
Great to see them all. I think Matt covered the basis relatively correctly. I'm a visual artist, and I've spent 28 years teaching at Lehigh University, and I taught everything from third grade up to high school, Friends School, Baltimore. I started teaching when I was a junior in college, but I also managed to, at the same time, juggle and create a professional career as a visual artist. For most of my 30s, I showed with June Kelly Gallery, who was then on Broadway, is now on Mercer, and built a career as a visual artist while building programs for people like Matt and Andrew and Tom and Domenica. And it's been my real pleasure to be at the intersection, as I like to call it, where my role is more one of validating spirits that have passion and power and potential, rather than being a quote unquote mentor. So, there's not a day that goes by that I'm not proud of the individuals whose vectors brought them into my orbit, and vice versa. I am recently, I walked away from teaching in 2017 I just decided to go on long-term disability, and until the end of last year, I was for 8 years the principal curator of the Petrucci Family Foundation collection of African American art. And in that period of 8 years, while I was teaching, while I was decoupling myself from the institution, I signed off by helping to raise a significant amount of resources to put together the new department physical location, and fund the mountaintop campus at Lehigh. So I really felt that I had done as much as I could do. And I think it's an important thing to know that when you've reached a point of impact, no matter how potent and how successful, it's important to step aside and let younger minds and younger passions take over. I think being a professor and being a father have taught me the same thing, that if you do it right, your children raise you. And so it's a real honor to be here today with all of you, through Matthew and Domenica and all the others, and Lisa reaching out to add where necessary, in my opinion. And it's great to be with you.
Thanks. I want to come back to that thought of impact in a second. Domenica, tell us a little bit yourself, because we know, one of the things I forgot to add is both of you are immigrants. You did not grow up in this country. So Domenica, tell us a little bit about your history and your story and how you found your way here.
All right. I guess I'll give like an abridged version, but I always had this ambition of like sort of, I don't know what it was, like the American dream, I guess, but coming to America and like pursuing my studies here, and sort of like set myself up to find ways to come here. So I went to a United World College my final 2 years of high school in a small kingdom called Eswatini. Some of you might have heard of it before as maybe Swaziland, but we sort of like grew up in a pretty like conservative country, but sort of in this bubble of like progressive attitudes and sort of like a space where ideally we were producing like globally minded students and citizens. So I always had this sort of passion for development, and it took me a couple of years to figure out what exactly that would fit in terms of a career. So I sort of stumbled into architecture in some ways. It was never like my plan A. And it's part of why I ended up at Lehigh, actually, because they had a really strong business school and a strong engineering school. So like me being unsure, sort of, it seemed like a good fit for me. So I ended up actually pursuing my Bachelor of Arts in Architecture with a minor in design at Lehigh, which I think was successful. And I never really felt totally prepared after those 4 years, especially being at a liberal arts college. So I went straight into a master's program at Princeton University, and I graduated just last year. And it was like sort of a funny time to graduate as well. The pandemic sort of having stalled everything and sort of rearranged everyone's plans. But luckily, I sort of, I was able to find a job in Philadelphia with what I consider a pretty dynamic, young group of, diverse group of architects here. So I've been sort of like getting my feet wet into like architecture as a profession only recently. But it's sort of, I guess like these last couple of months have sort of made me a bit more optimistic about the discipline as a whole. I think having spent 7 years in school and sort of developing a lot of these like academic ideas and like talking to a lot of people, it's somewhat instilled somewhat of like a cynicism about what we could do as designers and placemakers. So being in the profession finally is sort of actually helping me to gain back some of the optimism in some ways.
Domenica, I'm curious, just to play off of that, you talk about the American dream, and as a person growing up outside of America, you know, I think you had one sense of what this country is about. And I know when we had our conversation earlier, we talked a
Yeah.
little bit about this, but you know, the sort of this concept of blackness and the concept of blackness that existed where you grew up, which maybe didn't exist at all because you were in Mozambique, and what it was like to sort of see the American dream, get to America, pursue that dream, and how and I'd love for you to talk a little about how you were received or how that differed from, you know, your what you thought was going to be the case.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess I went into it a bit like naive, to be honest. Um, I had never really been, not that I'd never been confronted by my blackness, um, but having grown up in a place where, you know, blackness was all around me and it was a majority, um, I never felt like it was necessarily questioned. Um, and it wasn't necessarily a part of my identity. It was just another thing that I knew as truth, right? But coming to America, I think it made me sort of reconsider um, because race is such a real part of society here. I think it made me in lots of ways like become more aware of my own biases, which I had never been sort of confronted with explicitly, at least. So even though the experience has been sometimes pretty challenging, I'm grateful that it sort of like woke me up in a way to the realities that most people face, um, that I guess were sort of veiled in other ways in my life before because I lived in like a privileged little bubble of like, you know, progressive people or um, diverse communities and so on. So, um, yeah, it definitely changed my idea of what that American dream is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think it's much more mature now. And
And Barris, you had a similar experience, obviously coming earlier to this country, right?
Yes, if I could dovetail off Domenica, and please do stop me or interject as is necessary. But I was born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica. I was actually conceived in Birmingham, England. My parents were part of a generation after World War II that went over there to become um, to work in service industries so that Britain can develop its middle class after the devastation of World War II. So there's that. And then to add to my circumstance of blackness, what you cannot see because I'm effectively masking it right now. I've adopted this character for this discussion so it doesn't center around it, but I am physically deformed. There's my hand from shoveling snow. And I'm one of 26 people in this country that are legitimately children of thalidomide, as it says in the Billy Joel song, "We Didn't Start the Fire." So yes, 26 out of 320, 30 million people meant that from the moment I arrived here in 1971 at 10 and a half years old, um, I was not only confronted with the binary nature of race, which is black and or white, which I found really disturbing since I grew up in Jamaica, where interestingly, our national motto is out of many, one people. So my kindergarten, preschool, prep schools uh, were a litany of people of different shades of blackness, from the purple, black, maroons to people my skin color to high yellow to the Chinese, whites, and people from Asia, actual Indians, not Native Americans. And so every day in school for me, in a Catholic school, I was the only Catholic in my family, was an immersion in a kind of UN sensibility. And to make things more interesting, to fight classism and racism and these kinds of things, the nuns at my school, when you came to the school, they gave you a bag to reach into, and you had to grab a button, and you either got a red button, a blue button, or a yellow button. Saint Michael, Saint Gabriel, Saint Raphael. And so once you grab that button, you put it on your khaki uniform, and now you belonged like a fraternity. So that was to prevent bullying and so forth. So it didn't matter what you were. Everyone had to wear a pin every day. So it created a culture of togetherness. So it was very strange to grow up in that circumstance, in a culture that did not have the sensitivity of America. So on my way to school on a regular basis, I was teased. I don't mean like, oh, look at him, he's funny. I mean, overtly, directly. So I grew up really more concerned with my alien physical status and the inability of my countrymen to understand that a drug developed by the Nazis that my mother took caused my deformity. That was beyond Jamaica's cultural palette. So there was that. But when I came to America, what was really quite difficult was the idea of Blackness as a derisive or derogatory state of being. In Jamaica, we have a cultural practice of making fun of the things that are most sensitive. So the kids made fun of me because it was obvious that I had deformed limbs. And I had, that steeled me. So when I came to America and people would sort of give a furtive glance or stare at me, I was already equipped to deal with that. I was not equipped to deal with the idea that my mother would say to me when I got my first bike, you have to stop on Broad Street. You can't ride past that. And I'd say, why? And she said, well, that's a white neighborhood. The police will stop you. So, and that was quite difficult. Now, being Catholic, that meant that I went to the predominantly white Catholic school at the nice part of town. And then I took 2 buses back to the black part of town, because in 1971, America was a more racially divided, sort of where we're going back to now, these very strong divisional lines. So it was really odd for me to, on one hand, traverse in this new and foreign land to a space that was predominantly white, where I was an anomalous black. I didn't play basketball. So that was immediately suspect. I played soccer and I called it football. No, I was definitely a spy. And then take the bus back after that kind of experience with only my faith to connect me to that environment, back to the black part of town. And there were distinct roads. Once you crossed over Main Street heading, that was it. There were all whites got off the bus and you're now in the black part of town. And then the interesting thing is, once I got to the black part of town, the racial tension actually escalated. My black friends, in quotes, would ask me what the whites did that day. And, sort of everybody had an idea. The black community had an idea of the white community, and the white community had an idea of the black community that was untrue. So the first time someone called me nigger was a black person. The 10th time someone called me nigger was a black person. But my black friends were all saying to me, I bet they call you nigger, which was hilarious, because my white friends were Catholics. So they were like, no, you're one of us. So it was always a space, trying to find and navigate a space as a foreigner who walked into America's evolving history of race, and not find a space for my friends who were Chinese, and not see Chinese people and not see Indian people. It was all about the color of one's skin and what that allowed in terms of an understanding of your intellectual capacity and so forth. So, and I'll wrap up with this. In 6th and 7th grade, the way I dealt with this, which is a pronounced form of depression and displacement, was through art, through Marvel Comics, sketching, drawing. I mean, back then we had 3 TV stations, so I just stayed home all day drawing, doodling. And it was my librarian in elementary school who saw this ability and said, hey, you should think about becoming an architect. Mrs. Tenacity, never forget those people. And so she allowed for students who were so inclined in the 70s, who were at Trinity College in Hartford, to mentor me, to give me all the implements for beginning to design my first homes, and to mess around with architecture as a place to escape. And ultimately, that's what led me to Lafayette College, Lehigh's adversary, and through 79 through 83, where I came in wanting to be an architect in a place that had no architecture program. It was all engineering. The racism was palpable in the sciences. We didn't have computers, and PCs weren't around yet. We had to, C+ and Fortran and all this stuff. And it was just another layer of denial of my potential, of people looking at me incredulously and saying, I have a hard time believing that you, in that body, from your circumstance, from a third world shithole country, can have the capacity to be intelligent. And so it was a very difficult time, and it placed me within a domain that I think Domenica probably understands. If you're in a post-colonial world, everything white is good and everything bad is evil. And so the idea of coming into American history and understanding the contributions of African Americans across the sciences, across the arts, etc., was something that had to be threaded for worth.
Yeah, you had to search for it. It wasn't handed to you. Yeah. Yeah, Domenica, you said, you said that the experience made you aware of your own biases, which I think is a really, really interesting comment. I want you to expand on that, because it reminds me of something that Berris also said when he talked about just inherent prejudices, and that, Berris, you have also said that, everybody is inherently prejudiced, right? Everyone carries a prejudice with them. So I'm curious, Domenica, if you would just start on that concept of like aware of your own biases, and sort of what you learned from that, what that taught you, and then Berrisford, if you could extend on that.
It's hard to explain exactly what those biases are. I'm sure they're almost infinite. But I remember sort of being like faced with them for the first time at I think it was like at a Black student, it was like a Black student event. And we were mingling with like staff and faculty. And at the time, most of my friends, or most of the friends I had made at Lehigh, were actually not Black students, but actually international students. So mostly Chinese students. So it was really like the first time I interacted with the majority Black population really in the US. And then I remember a couple of students then at my table expressing their feelings and how they've experienced racism at Lehigh. And I remember the first thing I did was become like defensive for for the people they were talking about, who I knew some of. And so I sort of like tried to defend them. And I remember that was the first time they sort of looked at me like, how do you not understand this? And it took me a while to figure it out. I sort of left there feeling a bit like ostracized, but I think after reflection, and it's like reflection of like multiple years, and seeing things sort of unfold slowly, it became clear to me that I had a lot of unlearning to do. And that comes from like having lived in a colonized country, having been to pretty privileged school systems, and all these layers that we sort of like just took for granted, that I'd never really had to confront before. And it was just weird because I had grown up in pretty like diverse settings before. I attended international schools. I had lived abroad before. but it was interesting that that was really like the first time I understood that I had very obvious, explicit biases that I'd never really thought through. And
It's
yeah,
also,
Go
if I
ahead,
may
Barry.
interject, it's also an uncomfortable function. Domenica, again, please reply, but Lehigh and Lafayette fish in the same ponds. Lehigh is a university with 4 colleges. Lafayette is a private college, but they recruit. And I know this because I spent years at Lehigh recruiting students, period, but specifically students of color. So I know exactly the demographics that both institutions fish in. And the irony is that it is, and some of you might find this a bit sharp, but here goes. The irony and the sadness about it is that we have a similar kind of functional mentality from these institutions that belongs to diaspora and slavery. And that is, as I mentioned in our first conversation with Lisa and Matt and Domenica, that you put them together based on the color of their skin and they all become one thing. Even though, as Domenica was just saying, we came from vastly different backgrounds, socioeconomic circumstances, which shaped the way we saw ourselves and also shaped our ability to survive hard racist behavior. You know, if you're African American, I don't want to say that, oh, well, they were snowflakes or they didn't understand. Their history here was much more pronounced and much less flexible than my history in Jamaica. My history in Jamaica as a person of color was one that was based on class, not color. So even people who made fun of me, even people who looked at me with shame and ignorant fear, wait until I opened my mouth. And when they understood that I'd learned to speak the Queen's English and I went to a good school, they would literally, metaphorically genuflect and go, oh, I'm sorry, you're smart. And so, you know, we're going to now treat you a certain way. And that was also a shock to come to America, as Domenica was saying, coming from, you know, circumstances that our parents worked hard to achieve. My parents came back from the UK. The house I was born into had 10 rooms and a balcony and a maid and a large yard. And you could see the ocean from where I did my homework under the lamp on the rooftop. I mean, really? And then I came to America and both white and black people would say to me, as a function of their ignorance, and ignorance literally meaning the definition lacking knowledge of, wow, it must be great for you to be in America. And I'd say, yes, it's wonderful. It's a great opportunity. And they said, no, that's not what I mean. I mean, now you have better housing and, you know, there's more things. And I would have to keep my mouth shut because I was living in a 3rd floor walk up in the black part of town, dodging and ducking, you know, and bleaching for my life, as opposed to nirvana, you know, a yard with 12 fruit trees and a maid and a dogs and everybody, you know, basically I grew up in a black Leave It to Beaver world. Honest to God.
Let's stick on
I
this.
grew up in that world where I walked to school 2 miles and everybody knew me. That's the cat lady, that's the dog lady. So when I came here and I saw those programs as a person from Jamaica, I identified with them because even though all the characters were white and even though it was depicting falsely a kind of racially segregated, happy period of American life, to me, trying to desperately to hang on to some sense of self, I was like, oh, I get that. That was very much like my life. And I couldn't explain that to my African-American counterparts, that I didn't grow up in poverty, that I wasn't swinging from the trees, that not everybody is Bob Marley, and that I, in fact, grew up in a very strict, by American standards, conservative environment where my parents spoke and I shut the hell up, where there were consequences, where there were chores. You know, I lived in a very structured space. And to come to America, and the only structure that was defining me was my blackness, took years to comprehend.
Let's stay on this for a second, because I think this is something, frankly, that I learned the last time we spoke that was really kind of a radical moment for me. It's an American problem. I mean, we are very egocentric in the sense that we think our problems are the world's problems. But we spent a bit of time last time talking about the fact that these are really American problems, and that this type of polarization doesn't exist in the rest of the world, and that we actually could learn a lot from the rest of the world. And the point you made, Barris, I think you said it, was that when we think of people in this country, we think of immigrants, we think of the Irish and the Italians, and we think of the Germans that came and whatever, and people are nationalized. But when it comes to people of color, they're Black, right? Full stop. And it's not about a Jamaican versus a Mozambican versus Haitian versus some. We tend it becomes it's right. And I think and that was sort of frankly a light that went off in my head too, that everything you're saying is this reduction into only one thing, but that reduction doesn't exist when you go in other parts of the world. You guys both talked about your experiences in Asia and in other parts of the world and the way that you're perceived. And I'd love for you both to tell those stories, because I think those helped me understand my Americanness, right? That American lens.
I want Domenica to jump in because I don't want the old fart talking all the time, but I just want to clarify something that Matt said. I'm not bashing America. Trust me, if I'd stayed in Jamaica, the best that people would have allowed me to do is sit on the side of the street with, a tin cup between my toes, because I still go home to Jamaica and grown ass men and women look at me. I seriously had a guy who was naked, a Rastafarian, an indigent person, climb out of a dumpster, absolutely stark naked, walking down the street in a quiet town where my family has our beach home out there. And this guy, who was mumbling to himself and clearly, many levels below me, walked by me and saw me walking with my truncated, phocomelic left limb and just happy. And I remember this moment when he looked up at me and he shook his head, like, oh, poor thing. I'm like, dude, you just climbed out of a dumpster, and I live in America, and I didn't go there and people like gave me stuff. I worked hard to get it. And then I got in a car and people literally like come up to me for when I was in my 20s. No one would rent a car to me because the ignorant said, how can you drive a car with one arm? I'd pull out my American Express card and say, this is how I can drive a car. So I don't want to say like, oh, it's all America and everything was light and sunshine and kumbaya until I came to America. Racism exists everywhere. The legacy of post-colonial racism is a psychological construct. So one of the most racist people I've ever met in my life, and I have been confronted, cornered, and thrown against the wall by literal Klansmen when I was in grad school. And the most racist person I ever met was my great aunt's husband, who was light-skinned, we call high yellow, Jamaican. He despised Black people, despised them, okay? I mean, just, there was nothing redeeming about anyone that was as dark as me. So we grew up with, I just want to be clear that when we talk about these kinds of circumstances, or at least when I talk about these circumstances, that you all are clear that this is not coming from a position of bashing people. And before I forget, when Matt talks about the distilling or the winnowing down to Blackness, that is why when I write essays on art for my friends and colleagues who are nationally, internationally known artists, and I talk about Blackness in America, it's a capital B. I think one of the most important things you have to understand in the work environment and in your personal environment is that when you use a lowercase b, you're talking about a color. When you capitalize Black, when you're talking about the race of people specifically in America, you're talking about a state of being that was imposed on us. Why I don't capitalize white, I put it in single quotes and lowercase, is because it's an illusion. Because as Matt said before, ethnics in this country, I have signs that says no dogs, no Irish. You guys you studied in good schools, that there was 100 years war in Europe. And during that period, if you were Belgian or French or German, and you're in the middle of fighting other quote unquote Europeans, no one went up against their enemy and said, oh, I was going to stab you, but you're white. They stabbed him. So I think I have to understand here is something that's unique. If we're going to deal with this in a way that's productive and celebratory and invites everyone to make mistakes on the way to a deeper understanding of each other as people, we can't ourselves describe the position in terms of the binary circumstances that we despise that brought us to this failed understanding of each other. We can't. I just wanted to be clear up front before I let Domenica speak that I'm not here to sound in any way as if everything about America is the worst and being Black in America is the worst, so forth and so on. Domenica.
Yeah, I think the Americas in general have a unique condition of of a sort of dissociation or separation from history before colonialization. Well, I guess the colonization of America. So it's really hard to insert sometimes sort of, conversations around nationality and ethnicity and all these other parts of our identity that we can sort of build on that are just not afforded in this space in America. So I think it's important to allow, and I say this as a non-American Black person, but it's important to allow that sort of freedom, I'd say maybe, an affordance to Black Americans to sort of develop identities beyond Blackness. Blackness is not just a state of your race anymore. It's part of a culture in the American sphere, which is, I'd say, is completely different everywhere else in the world.
It is, right? I mean, there is a particular American lens. And agree, Barris, I'm not bashing America, but I'm just trying to point out that both of you told stories about being in other countries, in Asia, in Europe, where your perception of yourself and your Blackness is actually different than the way it is perceived in the US. So the US has a particular lens that is maybe different than other countries.
It has a particular history that stains everyone who lives here, whether we know it or not. After years after living here, and I won a fellowship, my first fellowship in my 20s as an artist, and I went abroad to live in Bristol, England, and I was acutely aware of its own slave history. And Bristol is a very segregated city. Most of the Blacks are West Indians. They live in St. Paul, but it's also the city where Massive Attack came from. So, plus and minus. So while I was there, it was incredible. And I met some really dear friends that I'd actually met in grad school in Baltimore. So we all got together and, I found myself trapped by the necessary mechanisms of racial identity in America. When I graduated from Lafayette College, my sophomore year roommate, who's still my friend, his dad was the first CEO of a major American merger, Sears and Lehman American Express. So I thought I knew what rich was until I hung out with John. His dad had just built a massive place in Boca Raton, and I went down there, and I had to drive down there with three of my best friends, one of my fraternity brothers, and two women that we knew, because John's family was putting us up at their brand new Pentagon-shaped building that hadn't even been open to the public and to the renters yet. So, privilege. I remember being terrified, and saying to them, I don't want to drive my brand new Camaro because I've got to drive through Georgia. Like my whole idea of driving through the South was informed by media. And frankly, it should be no surprise that we're in the mess we're in right now, because media is the strongest force of identity in America. I've said all my whole life here that America's greatest weapon is not its military, it's Hollywood. And so I didn't realize the extent to which my desire to survive in the ancillary but necessary history of Blacks in America, so that I need to know the mileposts, need to make sure that I didn't do things like I wanted to do all the time. I did Outward Bound. I went camping when I was, survival camping, and I was terrified equally of snakes and of white guys who would come up to me and basically say, "What are you doing invading my space of whiteness?" So I had what would be considered irrational fears, but they were based on the history. The more I learned about the history here, and I didn't realize to what extent I had consumed these negative tropes about myself until I traveled to Europe in the mid '80s, and my British friend said, "Hey, let's take the ferry over to Paris. Let's do Paris. I'm a young artist. I've been reading Henry Miller, and I want to live the life of the '40s. So we all jumped in my Saab and took the ferry over to Paris. It was fabulous. I was with my fiance. Who's this important British creative family. I was living the life." And I remember being in the metro, driving around Paris, going around Paris, and I saw this exquisitely beautiful little Black girl. And she was actually what we call in Jamaica purple Black. She was just deeply, richly dark. I looked light by comparison. But her features were completely opposite to what I saw of what were considered beauty in America. In other words, she had very high cheekbones and an incredibly tiny chin, and just the whole physiological shape of her head and her beauty I found arresting. And of course, I didn't want to be creepy. I'm 20-something-year-old guy staring at this little 6-year-old girl and just unable to avert my gaze. And she broke this with a smile, to sort of disarm my fears. She almost recognized the fact that I was not threatening her, but just amazed by her. And of course, she was African, probably Nigerian, probably Yoruba, and based on the images I've seen of the statuary, she seemed to be a walking statue. So she looked at me, I looked at her, and with my 4 friends, the 4 of us together could carry on a conversation in French, but each one of us had just enough to get a sandwich and a beer and ask where the bathroom was. So I looked at her and, of course, brought my baggage of American Blackness and leaned over with a sweet face and said, "Hello, how are you?" Of course, she answered in French, several different languages. And I realized how ignorant I was, that I had come over there as an American, expecting her to be Black American, not understanding that I had forgotten that we as people exist as citizens of other nations, not just Black people. And I remember being incredibly embarrassed at that moment, to the point that I still remember it now, that I had drank the Kool-Aid, that this young girl probably spoke at least 2 languages. I could barely speak 1 foreign language well. And yet here I was imposing my understanding of her Blackness, my American understanding, on her. So, I have many stories like that. I won't go down the road on them, but, every time I leave America, I say this all the time, I've traveled a lot. I mean, a lot, and I love it. And I think America looks better from farther away. I think when you're here, you get caught up in the caste, the class, the necessary spaces that you must inhabit so as not to offend people. Right. And America, Black and white, like I said earlier, I grew up in a space where, my aunt, who looked like Aunt Jemima, heavy-set woman, thick woman, who married a little Chinese guy. And when my dad would be drinking with him, after a couple of beers and some white rum, all the racist taunts would come out in the middle of the day. And it was so much more healthy because everybody was laughing. This Chinese guy would say to my father, "I was going to tell you about this thing, but you're obviously too dark to understand it." And he would say, "Oh, really? Can you see how dark I am with those eyes?" And, and I was sitting there after living in America and going, "Oh my God, I forgot. We make fun of each other as a way to diffuse tension." And it was just such a startling thing to come back to America and just everyone keep apologizing if they looked at me the wrong way. "Oh, I'm sorry, did I offend you?" And then for that to be turned into political correctness, which was, an antagonistic approach to decency. There's no such thing as
you very eloquently
not decent and
defined.
people call you out. That's not political correctness. If you're being an ass and someone calls you out, that's not political correctness. If you're being racist and someone calls you out, that's not political correctness. Just be decent.
you very eloquently defined the relationship between prejudice, bigotry, and racism.
Yes.
Um,
Everyone's
and
prejudiced. Every single
yeah,
person. When I go to Wawa's later today, or when I go to visit my framer and she introduces me to someone in her shop and he's wearing a lumberjack shirt or whatever, and whatever, and he looks like somebody I saw storming the Capitol, my first response is, okay, I'm out in the middle of Pennsylvania. This guy doesn't know I know the owner. I better be that black person that makes him like black people. Like I bring all this on to myself, and I'm waiting for the cues from him that says, I don't approve of you. So I'm prejudiced. I'm prejudging this guy. And I do it all the time because we're on Tinder, we're a tinderbox as a nation and as race. And then inevitably, sometimes these white, racist skinhead type guys, of course, turn out to be the most wonderful people. And I break say, hey, how are you doing? And hey, nice to meet you. Debbie said, and then I find myself sitting there for a couple of minutes going, you were just prejudiced. So everybody's prejudiced. I said to Matt and Lisa before that I believe, and this is just my humble opinion, that the next step is bigotry. And I believe people who are proud of their prejudice are bigots. If you're prejudiced and you catch yourself being prejudiced and you said, geez, why did I think that? She was obviously a sweet person. Why did I think that she's Chinese, so she's probably good at math? That's so stupid. You don't need to confess on that. You caught yourself being stupid. Move on. You're not the worst. If you're going around telling people that, hey, we had a candidate today who was Asian, and she's probably rich, and she's probably good, and you're proud of that, then I believe that is what constitutes bigotry. Someone who is not content with their prejudice being a subdermal kind of thing, but they want to corral other people who share that prejudice to assume a position of cultural power over them. That's still just a bigot. Archie Bunker was a bigot. He wasn't a racist, he was a bigot. Archie Bunker is a bigot, is a racist if he can stop someone from moving in his neighborhood. So bigotry with power is racism for me. And that's where I think you guys have to be careful in your work environment. Mm-hmm. When you make a misstep, in my humble opinion, just mine, and you recognize it as a sense of prejudging someone, pull them aside over a coffee and go, you know what? I just prejudged you. That was so stupid. I caught myself. And I'm guessing if that person's anyhow decent, they'll say, no worries, Jonah. We're good. I'm just picking on Jonah because I saw his name. We're good. It's fine. Don't worry about it, because we're here to design and we're going to murder people at Workshop APD. And you move on and you don't go home. You have to go confess. If you realize that you're around people who are speaking in a way that is diminutive to other people in an irrational way, so that you can be in and they can be out, that's when I think you have to challenge yourself. And if you find yourself saying that we really need to bring someone like Domenica on board, she's really bright, and someone saying, yeah, but we're good. If we bring her in, that's going to change the dynamics, and race, I'll have to be on eggshells and whatever. And then you make Matthew and Andrew stop a qualified candidate from coming in, then you're a racist, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And we mix them up so much in this country that if someone looks at you wrong, you go, what's the matter? You're a racist? And then that person gets all defensive, and then we don't get anywhere.
Right.
It becomes, I think we talked about this too, and we've got about 10 minutes, so I think this is a great way to wrap it up and maybe even get some questions, was that it takes that collective conscious, right, to affect real change. We have to all be in it together. It's not your problem, it's our problem, or it's our issue to affect change. We can't expect you to come to us with the solutions.
We didn't make it. We didn't develop a racist system that made everyone from essentially Europe, but we call it Africa. Just imagine if you called Europe, if tomorrow we woke up in the same world, everybody was exactly the same, but you looked in the map and and Europe was called Africa and Africa was called Europe. What, you're going to distinguish between the Europeans, or are you just going to call everybody from Europe Africans? It's crazy. It's a sickness, right? And we buy it because it's convenient. But I really think that we have to, yes, it's a collective thing, but It starts with the individual being willing to be, follow me here, damn good capitalists. Didn't think I was going to say that, did you? Racists are terrible capitalists. They're shitty capitalists. If you guys are all good and you're happy having your, you know, somebody, a hot woman work in your office so that she's eye candy for the front office, and you get a bunch of really talented young architects and designers coming into your company, and you won't take them in because they're women and you won't be able to make sexist jokes, you're not only shitty for the company, really, you're a terrible capitalist. You should be called out for being a terrible capitalist first. So get selfish about the company you work, the company you keep, and what you can do in small circumstances and in large circumstances to win, so that Workshop APD wins. Workshop APD is not responsible to go and get someone to be a Black token person. But if you find someone of any stripe who really is going to bring something that is going to give you a defining edge so that you can crush competition, and you don't get them because you're a little prejudiced or you're a bigot, you're a racist and you're an idiot, and it will cost the company.
Right.
Well said. Before we have to wrap up, I want to open it up to questions, comments. Anything that anybody wants to share. I honestly, I think we could listen to you guys for another hour.
Right.
It's so enjoyable.
I was going to say that as well.
Everybody else.
I just wanted to. Yeah. I don't have any questions because I have 50 questions. Domenica, Berris, it's just phenomenal to hear your insight. Berris, it's phenomenal to hear your voice. I relish everything that you've said, and all of your insight is, from both of you is absolutely unbelievable. It really is just such a special thing for us to be able to have this conversation. And I feel like this won't be the last time that we have this conversation. It's so important. Anybody else have any questions that you want to ask? By all means, jump in. Denali, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah.
Okay. How's it going? First of all, thank you both for speaking to us today. It was incredible hearing this. It's very familiar to me. I'm also West Indian, so a lot of this sounded very familiar. And I also wasn't born in this country, and coming here at a young age, I kind of realized a lot of the things you're talking about. I'm just curious, did either of your parents kind of create this idea of two different realities for you? Like for example, when I went home, my mom's like, when you step through this door, you're in St. Vincent. And when you go outside, you're in Brooklyn, New York. So she kind of created two separate spaces for me. So I have two ideas of Blackness in my head growing up. I'm wondering if your parents also kind of created this duality for you while you making your transition to American life.
Yeah, I think for me, in short, yes, but I think it was for different reasons. My father is a diplomat, so a lot of his thinking sort of revolves around the perception of others on yourself, right? So I was always sort of taught to like represent myself in the best manner possible, even if that sometimes meant I had to conceal my true feelings about things, and it's tough, especially when you're in a professional world, having to navigate sort of being somewhat or being assumed as like a spokesperson for a whole race or a whole group of people when you're by far maybe like the furthest from the average, right? So I think it's sort of like a weird juggling act where it's part of part of decorum and part of what's acceptable and part of like social norms, which are really all pretty randomized. But I think slowly but surely those boundaries or those sort of separations are sort of gonna start peeling back a bit, and being genuine won't be like a surprise or the normal thing to do, hopefully. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question, but hopefully it gives some insight too.
That's definitely great insight. Boundaries.
Well, Denali, I'm sure you're aware, and for the rest of you, you know, look up the writings of W.E.B. Du Bois on Tunis. Every African-American person in this country exists as masters of two distinct and necessary universes. I think I may have mentioned to Matthew last time and Lisa something that if I haven't, I'll repeat. If I did, forgive me, I'm repeating. But here's the problem. European culture is necessary as a metric for my intelligence. African-American culture is an option for you. So it'd be nice to blame all of you white people for being racist and not understanding me. But you have to understand that as long as your culture is required and mine is optional, we have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
If you can get an MFA or a PhD and not know anything about any Black people, any Black history, any Black architecture, any African design, anything to do with the people you're trying to make amends with or trying to function with, why should I recognize you? I have to be not just adept, but exemplary in all things European, all things Black American, all things West Indian. Because when I go to the Jamaican West Indian shop in Hartford, Connecticut, I better have the right track playing on my car radio, or else I'm suspect. If I go to Jamaica and open my mouth, literally speaking patois, the minute I open my mouth, there are Jamaicans who could tell me the year I left Jamaica, because the language is constantly evolving. So I have to be aware of that. And then I've got to write and speak the way I was taught in the Queen's English. I used to be a DJ, I used to spin at clubs, I've done voiceovers, and the amount of times I've called for basic services, someone to come to my house to fix something, and the gentleman or person shows up and they're shocked because I'm Black. I didn't sound Black. And my Black friends also suspect me because I speak the way I was taught to speak as a post-colonial. So it's a constant battle. And whereas it nearly took my life in terms of depression and drug use and all that when I was in college, one of my older sisters at one of my darkest days said to me, "Don't give up. Remember, you may feel less than, but you're actually more than. You're actually juggling and navigating 3 universes every single day you get up with such expertise and finesse that you're not throwing it in anybody's face, you're just getting on with it. Domenica is just getting on with it. Denali is just getting on with it. We're not there to run away from anything. We are there to run towards a space where our intelligence, our ambition, our humanity can be valued, and we can exhibit, inhabit, and reflect that so that we become the beacon for a greater understanding. We're not the spokesman for all Black people, but we can be a circumstance, if I could use that word, for a deeper understanding that is not one of perpetual guilt for being white. The next time we speak, we should talk about why I think racism will never be solved until we deal with the never spoken about backlash of being labeled white.
Mm.
If you have to lose your ethnicity like me, and when I lose it, it really hurts me, no one is asking you what it means to just be white when you are clearly French or clearly German or clearly Ukrainian or clearly whatever. And that is so much part of how you speak, what you eat, who your grandparents are. No one cares about that. No one cares about you walking down the street, 2 of you laughing and joking, And some Black young men or women might see you and go, what do you know of my ethnicity? You're just white. Tell me that doesn't hurt. Tell me that doesn't demean and diminish your presence. So this is something that we have to look through both sides of the telescope. Matt's right, we can't fix racism because we didn't build it. But we are intelligent enough to understand how to dismantle it in ways that allow our lives to be more meaningful in terms of our relationship with other people who don't look like us.
Thank you guys. Those responses really made me feel good. It was one of the first times in a long time that I received an answer from a question that made me feel better than I did. So yeah, thank you so much.
And and Denali, Barris is amazing. You both Barris and Domenica, have so much to share, and so we can certainly connect you offline if you ever wanted to reach out. I know that Barris is always available.
Yes.
Does anybody else have any
more deeper, more? This is the first time a lot of you have seen me. You might have heard of me before, or whatever. Who cares? But ultimately, as they say, I'm Googleable. And if we want to have this, if we want to go deeper into this, I think what Domenica and I'm speaking for her, forgive me, Domenica, but I think what we're both capable of because of our circumstances and because we're not afraid to speak truth about our experiences without, undermining ourselves or pretense, is I'm very much willing after this conversation, if you want to go deeper in a more personal way, to not be as verbose and get to the answer, that will help.
It's funny, we keep saying to the people that have joined us for these, Barris and Domenica, that we're not just trying to expand our perspective. This is about a better, broader, more diverse network and a family.
Right.
And you're sort of unavoidably part of the workshop family now. So sorry.
Pleasure.
I don't have a question, but I just want to, I feel like I gained a lot of knowledge today that I think is, if we can continue to have these talks in our office and bring in exceptional folks like yourself. And again, Barris is sort of unique in that, like, he was literally our teacher for a couple of years. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And you look exactly the same, by the way. But I feel like I really learned something, and that is an incredibly rewarding. I learned a perspective that I don't think I'm smart enough or worldly enough to understand, and if we can do that, I think we can make steps towards trying to be better people. And I think at the end of the day, if you can wake up every day and look in the mirror and feel like you're being a better person, a more that drives towards equity and strong leadership, then I think we have a chance as a race. If you can't do that, then ultimately the world's going to kill itself, and we're all going to just end up like we saw a couple weeks ago with nonsense going on down in DC. So I really thank you guys. I mean, I'm sorry I haven't been part of these pre-conversations, but everybody's just said how phenomenal the two of you are, and bringing your perspective is really, I feel really good. This was a really productive, positive learning experience. So thank you.
You're welcome. And I just want to thank personally Domenica. One of the things that I loved teaching at predominantly white top 50 schools like Lafayette and Lehigh is that I was there to interact, as I said earlier, with people who had the passion and the heart and everything that I recognized in myself in them, not the race.
Right.
I didn't look at Andrew and Matt and think, oh, those are interesting white kids. I looked at them as, wow, I see myself in them, and there's all kinds of old adages, but one of them is, if you have 15 people in the room plus one teacher, then you've got 16 students, and I think it's the same kind of thing in the work environment. If you have 2 bosses and 3 bosses and 12, workers, then you've got, the same amount of bosses and workers. You know what I mean? If you're going to make the changes, if you're going to allow for people to make impact that is going to shift things. And again, I have no problem with being selfish. You know, I want workshop APD to crush, just to be cards on the table. I want you guys to crush. And that's why we're here. But to be able to run into people like Domenica and to know from the first conversation that everything we shared with you today, I knew that from the first time I spoke with her. Just like when Denali said, oh, I was like, okay, I got you. You know, and it's such a wonderful thing to be a rare professor. It has its downsides. I have had problems with being the first Black male who occupied a position of power over young white males and females who had never been in a position before in their lives where a Black male held the keys to power and was the king of that kingdom of learning. And believe me, it has not all been pleasant. But what makes it all worthwhile and why I stayed with the gig so long and why I don't have any regrets about it is that every year I thought I would quit, I'd meet Domenica, and then she'd leave and there'd be another one, and then she'd leave and there'd be another one. You know what I mean? It was just wonderful people, not wonderful Black people, just wonderful people that I knew that if I, by my presence, by my actions, by my insistence on the quality of the knowledge I was imparting, on challenging them to be their best, not best white, best female, best whatever, but just best, that was the mission that didn't need to be spelled out on the syllabus. That is the mission. That is why I can speak about it so freely and so verbosely. This isn't something I made up. This is something I discovered on the way there. It's ironic that a little one-armed kid from Jamaica who grew up in a completely different environment comes to America in its binary system, goes to the wrong school, gets crushed academically, changes his major. He was supposed to take his architecture design classes at Lehigh, and then in the same lifetime, the same arc of the same lifetime, winds up being the chairman of the department.
Runs the program. I know. It's
you know,
you
so
couldn't make that
so
shit up. You couldn't make that shit
No,
up.
I have faith. I have faith in abundance.
Because Barris, what trumps it all, and what frankly what brings us together as a community, and frankly trumps most of these discussions. I hate using the word Trump, sorry, but it's the right use of it in this case. Is the power of passion and the power of talent. And you know, we the three of us that learned from you, that were with you, were inspired by you, and in turn you inspired us and we inspired you. And it was that passion, that talent, seeing your relationship with Domenica, seeing her potential, seeing real talent, sort of made everything else worthwhile. That's why we do what we do, and that's why we're in the community we're in, and that's why we still do it, right? And so it's seeing, and you know, your passion is palpable. It always has been. It is what sort of, you know, always ignited us. It's the reason you ended up leading the department, because that passion and that talent trumps all, right? That's what our industry, that's what our community holds to the highest esteem.
I gave you guys a lot today, and I'm proud of it, but I'm also kind of aware that not everything is going to stick. So as we're wrapping things up, I just want to say with my full heart, keep in mind as a template the difference between being prejudiced, being bigoted, and being racist. If you find yourself being prejudiced and even bigoted, the answer is not condemnation. You know, nothing happens if you get angry at yourself for making a mistake. The answer is to see yourself, and in your own time, like, you know, we all have egos, and your ego is not you. Your ego hates you. Your ego says stay in bed instead of work, you know? So your answer is not to believe that the voice in your head is you or right. Your answer is to say to yourself, I see you, to that dark thing in you. I see you. You don't need Denali or anybody else to forgive you. Just see yourself, understand yourself, and forgive yourself immediately, and then make actions towards a better understanding of that thing that you just failed at. Now, that's not only about race, that's also about being good architects and designers. It's the same thing. In the absence of mistakes, you learn nothing. So this idea that I'm going to speak to you and you're all going to go back into the workplace and get it, in quotes, is asinine. And I just wanted to make that clear to you. It's asinine. Understand that you don't just unpack everything that you packed into being you. Andrew Hacker wrote a book, Two Nations, one black, one white, separate and unequal. and they turn it into a shitty movie, I think, called Soul Brother, where a white kid wakes up and he's black. It's the worst movie ever to take a really good piece of literature and race politics. But I would, when I taught my freshman seminar, as a way of being a provocateur, I would take a passage from that book that Hacker posited, to understand race and to understand privilege. And it goes like this. Imagine that tomorrow morning you wake up and there are 2 federal agents. There's no COVID. 2 federal agents come to your door. Let me pick a name. Andrew Klein. Hi, Andrew. So they say, good morning, Andrew. And you're like, what did I do? Did I break the law? I said, no. We are from the government and we're part of the census, the race census squad. And we realized something, that we made a mistake when you were born. Yes, you're male, and yes, you were born into whatever your parents' name were, and yes, you were born in this town and that hospital. But according to our records, you were supposed to be black. Okay, so we have to fix that. And because we know this is a gross inconvenience to you, that we've made a mistake, tomorrow morning when you wake up, you will be black. Now, your parents will be the same. You live in the same house, same street, same friends, same job, same country club, same whatever. Everything will be the same, but you'll be black. Now, because of this gross mistake on our part, Hacker argues or posits, here's a blank check for your inconvenience. And Andrew, you can write it for any amount you want, but understand, tomorrow you will be black in this America. Same girlfriend, same wife, same whatever, but you will be black. And for our inconvenience, write this check for $1 billion, we will honor it. Write it for no dollars, fine. But what do you think it'll take for this gross mistake of race placement? I gave that to my students over the weekend. I asked them to come back on Tuesday with their answers, 1 page, and we read them aloud in class. And it went from liberal, nothing, because, people were all the same, to tens and hundreds of millions of dollars because whatever. Hacker's point was very simple. You all know there's a problem if you wake up black.
Right.
There's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And even if we pay you Michael Jordan money, Tiger Woods money, you're going to run into some walls. So please don't pretend that you don't understand what it means to be black in America. And we could use the same situation for gender. If I woke up tomorrow and I was a female, my world changes dramatically. So it's an easy thing to go, it's a black thing you don't understand. I wish I could understand. What do I have to do? How do I fix this? How about just thinking about that? What would you do? How much would you write that check for, and why? And in that answer, you'll find out what you already know. And once you find out what you already know, you've got somewhere to start.
It's true.
That is a fantastic way.
My
to end
brain's
this,
exploded.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Barris, I think you just left all of
Thanks.
us with a lot of.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, that was. If you I wish you were holding a mic right now, because you could just
No.
mic drop.
Oh,
Thank you
wow.
both very, very much. We do have to end this because everybody's got work to do. But thank you so much. You have taught us, inspired us, and we look forward to the next conversation.
You're very welcome. I'm here, and Domenica. The first thing when Lisa called me was, I said, not me, get Domenica. And we're here, if I may speak for her again, because you are fortunate enough to work with a group of men who are not only exemplary in their skills and their ambition, but in their desire to make better people of themselves. And whether you guys make incremental leaps in terms of race and race understanding, or you make huge leaps, is second to the fact that you're in an environment where the power structure is requesting that you do that. So you've already made some great decisions in your lives, and I think that's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barris.
Ciao, guys.
Thank you, Barris.
Yeah.
Barris.
Yeah.